In today's video, we'll be running through a bunch of big old army-sized war games and putting them through a shootout to determine which is the most expensive and which is the cheapest to get into and also to play going onward. And if that sounds like fun to you, don't forget to hit that like button. You can also subscribe to the channel and enable notifications if you want to stay up to date on what I'm doing here on YouTube. And if you really love the content, there are some links below in the description for how you can support the channel. So, if I'm more of a skirmish gamer, why are we shooting out army games? Well, for one reason, because army games are just more popular, and this content isn't for me, it's for you. But also, I feel like by avoiding skirmish games, I can also avoid too much bias, because these are all games that I both do not play, and am not super likely to ever play, meaning it's a lot easier for me to give a more even rundown. So one last thing before the shootout commences, and that is metrics. We'll be comparing each game by looking at its two-player starter set first of all to determine a point of entry, since most people get into games through their two-player starter sets. We'll then look at expanding that starter set into a full army as a ongoing cost projection to give us an idea of what most people's experience would be turning that starter set into a functioning, playable, full-sized army. We will of course also include any mandatory books or accessories in these calculations as well, because to go out and play these games in the wild, you'll need them. I won't say which one, but I am going to use the same online store wherever possible to compare all of these games, just to give the fairest look at the pricing overall. And also, if there's anywhere that I get stuck where I'm not sure how you would expand into a full army, or if something just doesn't really make sense to me, I'll be using Reddit and other social media outlets to poll community consensus first of all, before making any conclusions. So, let's compare some war games. Okay, well, you may as well get your groaning out of the way early, because this is either going to come as no surprise at all or the biggest surprise in the world. But it is indeed Warhammer 40,000 that represents our lowest value proposition. The fantasy in space super sci-fi mega giant offers a very competitive point of entry at just £52 for the middle tier of the starter edition. But on top of that, you're also going to need a £20 codex in order to get access to your faction's full rules. So that's an entry point of £72. And that £72 point of entry is, well, actually super competitive, one of the best that we're going to see today. But it's when you start to expand things up to 2,000 points that we encounter a problem. Thanks to 40k's cripplingly bloated codex and supplement system, the cost of getting up to a full 2,000 point army at this point from either of the armies that are in the starter set, it's going to be between £416 and £450. And the way I've expanded that starter set is to add a couple of combat patrol boxes and a couple of centerpieces to either of the starting armies. But there's also just a bunch of extra books we have to bundle in too. But it is worth noting, in the interest of fairness, that if you could snag yourself one of the few remaining Indomitus boxes that are out in the wild, you could get yourself a Space Marine or a Necron army up to a functional size for a lot cheaper. But then even that said, it would be more expensive than our next game. A Song of Fire and Ice is a really interesting one because it's a setting that by and large most of you are probably familiar with. You're not really going to need any introduction to Westeros to know whether or not a Game of Thrones miniatures game is going to be something that interests you. However, despite it having some really cool miniatures and some very kind of old school rank and flank vibes that might really tickle your pickle, the point of entry is a bit scary. The starter set weighed in at £107.99, which is no small chunk of change, and especially when you consider that you might be wanting to pick up that starter set just as a punt, just to give it a try. Story does get a little bit better as we expand out into a full army though, where it appears that 2 or 3 of the £30-ish expansion boxes added to half of the starter set will get you up to a functioning army. And according to my notes, that means it's about £140 to £170 to get up to a functioning army, which is actually not super bad at all. It's definitely at least significantly cheaper than 40k, and compared to other games, it's okay. Maybe if you're interested in armies that aren't in that starter set though, it does start to look a bit a little bit rough. But really, the reason this one ranks so low is just because that point of entry is so much higher than any of the other games I looked at. And I can't really forgive that for a game that's from such a popular franchise that is probably going to attract a bunch of notice and a bunch of attention, and they probably could have afforded to go in at a lower point of entry. Okay, this one is both a bit unfortunate and a little bit confusing because the numbers aren't going to exactly make sense with the placing that I've given it. So I'm going to have to do some justifying. The high fantasy game from Parabellum Wargames offers some really nice broad-ranging factions and a pretty cool setting, to be honest. The miniatures are a little bit larger in scale than your average miniatures as well, and this actually, whilst being a bit of a cool feature in one hand, does expose our first problem. Because they're larger in size, the detail is more pronounced. You can see it easier. But the problem is that same detail is very soft and not really very crisply sculpted. Kinda makes the minis look a little bit cheap, if I'm honest. The resin character models are gorgeous and really well sculpted and look absolutely beautiful, but everything is pretty premium on the old pricing side as well. So as you start to step out into expanding, things are not going to look great for buying more models down the line. So with a £79.99 starter set, it's a bit more expensive than the next game we're going to feature, so you might think that's fair enough for placing it this low down. However, my expansion plan for this game is to split the starter set with a friend and then add a warband set. And this gives us a functional army value of 135 to 175, which actually makes it really similar to our previous entry. So maybe doesn't justify it being this low down after all. It might well seem like numbers 4 and 3 should be switched, but with those kind of cheap looking miniatures, it's a bit hard to justify placing this higher. Plus, when you see what our next entry is, I think it's going to make further sense. Well, those of you who think I'm some big, mean Games Workshop hater, you'll be surprised to see me placing this above anything indie, let alone on the podium. Yeah, I get to feel smug, I guess, about toy soldiers. Great. But EOS actually offers some really interesting differences to 40k that make me wish I could place it even higher than I have. The 40k not in space setting from Games Workshop has a chunk of really cool factions, and also some incredible centerpiece models. In fact, it's generally the consensus of quite a good majority of the wargaming fanbase that EOS is where Games Workshop does most of their best sculpting. The middle tier starter set is again £52, much like 40k, and you will need a day 1 DLC mandatory battle tome in order to get your full rules. So it's the same point of entry as 40k, £72. But things actually start to look even more exciting when we shake things out into a full force. Expanding that starter set out into a full army is going to cost you in the region of £236 and £260, depending on if you can split the box or not. And we're achieving this in the same way we did with 40k, by adding a couple of start collecting boxes to that and then a couple of centerpieces. However, do you notice how much cheaper that comes out than 40k? Well, that's because, unlike 40k, EOS does not force players to buy a bunch of expensive additional books in order to be able to play properly. Somehow, that game seems to have just avoided Games Workshop's bloatfest. And if you add to that the fact that those beautiful minis are also a bit cheaper when you buy the start collecting boxes as compared to 40k's combat patrols, and it soon turns into some very real savings. So when we consider the quality of the product line, the aggressively costed point of entry, the wide availability of other people to play with, and many other positive factors, things look a bit better for EOS than perhaps the raw figures alone would suggest. And also, don't forget, again, much like with 40k, there's that Dominion box if you want additional savings. Picking up one of those is going to make that Orc or Stormcast army much cheaper to get to 2,000 points. However, do also bear in mind that if you were to buy into EOS, you are buying into the Games Workshop ecosystem, and you will be harangued constantly at every opportunity to go deeper and deeper in. And that might be something that doesn't make you comfortable, might be something that you're fine with. So if you like supporting big evil corporations and GW just aren't mean enough for you, Did you know you can actually support the mouse whilst getting your miniatures fix? Star Wars Legion is another game set in a universe we're all very familiar with, and as such needs no introduction for you to know if it's for you or not. With a $79.99 starter set, this could easily be placed further down the list, closer to Conquest. But there's an interesting story to tell as we start to expand. Where Star Wars Legion scores big with me is in just how cheap you can get a functioning army. Because this was one of those points where I was a bit confused. I couldn't really tell how to turn the starter set into an army off of what I was reading on the internet. And then I found a Reddit thread that explained exactly that, and the consensus was that you should go halves with a friend on 2 of the starter boxes, and each of you keep one of the individual armies, both copies of it. From there, you would only need to add something like a speeder to the Rebel side or an ATST to the Imperial side, and you'd be up to a fully functioning army. That seems very easy. And the cost of that? Between £105 and £190, depending on if you can split those starter boxes. And considering that this is Star Wars, I'd be quite surprised if you can't find someone to split those starter boxes with you. What this ends up meaning is that if you do end up at that £105 price point, this is actually the cheapest game that we'll feature today. However, you should also bear in mind that there has just been a price hike on Star Wars Legion products, which might not have filtered through to the LGSs that I was checking for prices. But considering that it has the cheapest full army cost of everything that we've looked at, why is it in second place? What the fuck is Kings of War? Is exactly what I said to myself when I first looked into this, but it was something that's been suggested by my comment sections quite a bit, so I decided to take a look into it. And it turns out it actually has a really weird amount of pedigree, and in fact it is me that is completely ignorant and should definitely have known what it is. Because it's a fantasy rank and flank game from Mantic Games. Who are Mantic Games? They are the brainchild of former managing director of Games Workshop, Ronnie Renton. They also happen to be based in Nottingham, England, which is just down the road from me. But as such, this game is going to remind you heavily of OG Warhammer Fantasy Battle, which is pretty cool if you're into that kind of thing. There's a starter set called Shadows in the North that costs £64 from where I checked, and even includes a bonus expansion book. The armies that are in it are also really well sized. But from here, building an army is, well, a doddle, because they just sell full armies, and they're like £90. The one that I looked at was 98 models for that as well. It is ridiculously cheap. Somehow I got distracted in the middle of this by American snacks. Oh yeah, that's right, Kings of War. True rank and flank bliss. It should be noted though that some of the miniatures are PVC, which is an absolute pain in the arse to get the mould lines off of. You have to kind of slice them off, not scrape them off. But if you're willing to forgive that, that price point is very good. However, another thing you're going to want to be aware of is that because the company is kind of a spin-off of GW, they also have a kind of spin-off of their business model, which means that there are a bunch of supplements and extra things that you probably want to buy. The minimum of these is going to be some spell cards, some movement trays, and an objective set, which is going to add up to about 50 quid to your buy-in point. However, even with that considered, this is still a really bloody cheap game to play. And so with that in mind, I have no choice but to watch it storm easily into first place as the best value for money proposition army-sized war game that I managed to do research on. Of course, value for money is not the only metric by which we judge things, especially in war games where it's actually kind of a low priority for a lot of people. However, I thought it also presented a bit of an interesting point of discussion because we don't necessarily often look at other war games side by side to each other purely from that perspective of what it costs to play and how worth it that might be. So do you play any of these games? Tell me in the comments what they're like. Are there any that I missed off that you'd like me to cover in a follow-up to this video? We could definitely do this again. Let me know in the comments below and we'll have a chat about it. So until next time, friends, I'd like to thank you very much for watching this one and wish you happy hobbying. I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye for now.